He thought he could corner Karoline Leavitt, but she turned the tables and exposed his biggest lie on live television. The studio lights shone brightly, reflecting off the polished glass desk where the night's most anticipated debate was about to take place. The Evening Pulse, the network's flagship political talk show, had built a reputation as a battleground, and tonight was no exception. On one side of the desk sat Graham Walters, the network's top political commentator. A seasoned host with decades of experience, he was known for his aggressive style: interrupt, reframe, dominate. His audience expected him to dismantle his guests, especially conservatives. Opposite him, Karoline Leavitt adjusted the lapel microphone clipped to her navy blazer. She knew exactly what she had walked into: hostile territory, where both the studio audience and viewers at home were unlikely to be on her side. As the intro music faded and the camera zoomed in, Graham wasted no time. Tonight, we have Karoline Leavitt, former Trump White House assistant press secretary and political commentator. She's here to discuss the economy, media responsibility, and some, let's say, controversial claims she's made about our network. He chuckled, shaking his head as if he had already won the debate. Karoline, let's start with something simple. You've been very vocal about what you call media manipulation. You claim networks like ours intentionally mislead the public. That's a pretty serious accusation. Where's your proof? Karoline remained unfazed. She kept her expression calm, even as she sensed the audience waiting for her to stumble. Instead, she met his gaze and responded smoothly. Graham, I don't need to make claims. The proof is in your own reporting. Tilting her head slightly, she continued, let's talk about inflation. Last year, this very network told Americans inflation was transitory, that concerns about it were right-wing fear-mongering. Now, families can barely afford groceries. Eggs are up 30%, gas prices have skyrocketed, and suddenly, you all act like this is new information. So tell me, was it incompetence or dishonesty? The smirk on Graham's face flickered. He had expected pushback, but not like this. Well, Karoline, economics is complex, and no one could have predicted. She cut him off, her tone sharp yet controlled. No one? Or just the media? Because experts warned about this for months. But they weren't the ones you put on air, were they? A murmur rippled through the audience. Graham leaned back slightly, gripping his cue cards a little tighter. Look, we report facts, and if you want to cherry-pick. Cherry-pick. Karoline pressed on. Let's talk about crime. Your network spent months airing segments on mostly peaceful protests while cities burned. You downplayed riots, ignored small business owners losing everything. And now, suddenly, crime is a major issue, because polling shows voters care about it. So which is it? Did crime just appear out of nowhere, or did you ignore it because it didn't fit your narrative? Graham exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. His usual rhythm, where guests fumbled, backpedaled, or deflected, wasn't working. Karoline remained composed, and the audience could sense it. But he wasn't ready to give up control. Straightening up, he prepared to turn up the heat. "All right, Karoline," he said with a forced chuckle. "You're passionate, I'll give you that. But let's be real. Conservative media does the exact same thing. They push their own agenda, spin stories, ignore facts. Do you expect people to believe that only liberal networks are guilty of this?" It was a classic move. Flip the accusation, paint her as a hypocrite. He expected her to fumble. She didn't. "Oh, I fully acknowledge that media bias exists on both sides," she replied without hesitation. "The difference is, conservative outlets don't pretend they're neutral. Fox News, for example, openly leans right. But your network sells itself as unbiased, as the trusted source. And that's the problem, because you're not. Graham's jaw tightened. The audience might not have noticed, but Karoline did. You say you report facts, she continued, unwavering. So let's test that. Crime is skyrocketing in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and San Francisco, all Democrat-run. But if someone watches your network, they'd think crime is just a right-wing talking point. That's dishonest. Why not just tell the truth? That's ridiculous, Graham shot back. You cover crime when it's convenient, she interrupted. Your network only started reporting on the recent crime wave after swing state voters ranked it as a top concern. Before that, you dismissed it as hysteria. Come on, Graham. Do you really think people don't notice? His lips pressed together. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. Pivoting quickly, he seized a new angle. Let's talk about January 6th, he said, his voice gaining an edge. Your side defends what happened that day while condemning other protests. You call for law and order, except when it's your people breaking the law. How do you justify that? A ripple of anticipation moved through the audience. Now he had her. At least that's what he thought. Karoline inhaled deeply, nodding as if she had expected this. Graham, I've said from day one that anyone who committed a crime that day should be prosecuted. But let's compare that to what your network did in 2020. You downplayed months of riots, looting, and violence as mostly peaceful. You defended politicians who bailed rioters out of jail. And yet, January 6th is treated as the single greatest threat to democracy, while entire cities burned under policies you refuse to criticize. That's the double standard, and Americans see it. The studio fell silent. Even some panelists glanced at Graham, waiting for his response. He needed to regain control. So what, Karoline? You're saying we shouldn't talk about January 6th? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. No, she said firmly. I'm saying tell the truth. Cover both. Hold everyone accountable, not just when it's politically convenient. That's what real journalism looks like. For a brief moment, Graham hesitated. His mind scrambled for his next move, the next attack, but the energy in the room had shifted, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he was the one in control anymore. Graham forced a grin, the kind that masked irritation. He wasn't used to losing ground this early. His guests typically buckled under pressure, struggled to keep up. But Karoline wasn't flustered. She wasn't scrambling. If anything, she was settling in, taking her time, making every word count. "All right," he said, exhaling through his nose, flipping his cue cards for a new angle. "You've had your moment, but let's talk about something else. Misinformation. You and others on the right love to throw that word at us, but your side is guilty of spreading just as many lies. Take the election fraud claims, for example." Karoline lifted a hand slightly, stopping him. "Wait, hold on," she said, tilting her head. "You're talking about misinformation?" Graham blinked. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Okay then, let's really talk about it." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise. For months, your network told people that if they got the COVID vaccine, they wouldn't get infected, period. You called anyone who questioned it a conspiracy theorist. And now, 2 years later, the same health officials you praised are admitting that wasn't true. That's misinformation. Where was the correction? Where was the accountability? The audience murmured. Graham's eyes flickered toward his producers. He hadn't planned for this detour. That was based on the best available information at the time. "No," Karoline interrupted, shaking her head. That's not how journalism works. The best available information should have included the voices you silenced. Scientists, doctors, people who had concerns. Instead, your network demonized them, got them banned from social media. And now you're pretending it never happened. Graham clenched his jaw. All right, you want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about your side's responsibility for political violence. You all act like it's only one party at fault, but let's not forget, Republicans have pushed dangerous rhetoric too. Donald Trump told his supporters to fight like hell on January 6th. Some of them listened. People got hurt. How do you defend that? It was a classic play. Bring up Trump, make her defend him, put her on shaky ground. But Karoline wasn't biting. First of all, Graham, I don't defend violence, ever. But since you brought up rhetoric, let's be consistent. When Senator Chuck Schumer stood in front of the Supreme Court and told justices they would pay the price if they ruled a certain way, and then a man showed up outside Brett Kavanaugh's house with a gun, was your network outraged? No. You barely covered it. Graham opened his mouth, but she kept going. When Maxine Waters told protesters to get more confrontational with political opponents, and conservatives were harassed at restaurants, chased out of public spaces, where was the outrage? Where was your call for accountability? The audience was shifting. The balance of power in the room had tilted, and Graham could feel it. Look, he said, running a hand through his hair, this isn't about cherry-picking incidents. No, Karoline countered. This is about double standards. That's why people don't trust you. Because if political violence is wrong, and it is, then it's wrong no matter who does it. And if rhetoric is dangerous, and it can be, then you need to call it out everywhere, not just when it helps your ratings. She leaned forward slightly. So, Graham, I'll ask you, can you admit your network applies different standards based on the political party involved? For a fraction of a second, Graham Walters, the man known for always having the last word, hesitated. But that second of silence said more than any response ever could. Graham shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the weight in the room. His job was to control the conversation, steer it back to safe waters. But Karoline had flipped the script, and now, for the first time in years, he was the one grasping for footing. His earpiece crackled, a producer, no doubt urging him to cut to a break. He ignored it. He wasn't going to let this moment spiral any further. "All right, Karoline," he said, forcing a chuckle. "You've made your accusations. But let's be honest. You're part of the right-wing media machine yourself. You act like an outsider, but you push talking points just like everyone else. If networks like ours are guilty of bias, what makes you any different?" It was a last-ditch effort to discredit her, to make her seem like just another partisan player. But Karoline didn't flinch. "I'm different because I don't pretend to be something I'm not," she shot back. "I don't sit behind a desk, claim I'm objective, and then quietly push narratives that benefit one political party. That's what your network does, Graham. You claim to be fair. You claim to be neutral. But the facts prove otherwise." Graham scoffed, shaking his head. "You keep saying facts, Karoline, but all I hear are opinions." That was the moment. The precise second everything shifted. Because Karoline was ready for this. She reached into the stack of papers she had brought with her, a calculated move, and pulled out a printed headline from Graham's own network. She held it up, letting the cameras capture every word. "This was your network's headline in 2021. Crime wave is a GOP scare tactic. But fast forward 2 years, and now you're running segments on the crime crisis. So which is it, Graham? Was crime a scare tactic? Or is it a real issue now that it's affecting voter sentiment? She didn't wait for him to answer. She reached for another page. Here's another one. Inflation fears are overblown. Economy is strong. You ran this in early 2022, while Americans were already struggling to afford basic necessities. By the end of the year, you admitted inflation was a serious crisis. So what changed? The economy, or your willingness to admit the truth? The audience murmured. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw was tight. But Karoline wasn't done. "And this one," she said, pulling out one last sheet, her voice steady. "Hunter Biden laptop story is Russian disinformation. Your network ran that headline over and over, called it a conspiracy, mocked anyone who even questioned it. But now, even your own journalists admit the laptop was real. And you expect the American people to just forget that?" Graham's face darkened. The studio was dead silent. A few rows into the audience, someone let out a quiet, "Wow." The panelists at the side of the set, usually quick to jump in and back Graham up, were stiff in their seats. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Karoline set the papers down. "So tell me, Graham, where's the accountability?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Embarrassment. Frustration. He glanced off camera, toward his producers, as if hoping for an escape route. Nothing came. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something. Some prepared line. Some well-rehearsed dismissal. But nothing came. Because there was nothing he could say. And in that moment, the great Graham Walters, the man who had humiliated countless conservative guests, was speechless. The silence stretched. Longer than it should have. In television, dead air was a cardinal sin. Producers scrambled behind the scenes, trying to salvage the moment. But the damage had already been done. Graham Walters, the man who built a career on controlling conversations, had no response. No witty comeback. No rehearsed deflection. Karoline sat still, watching him, letting the weight of the moment settle in. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She just waited. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Some viewers shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The usual flow of the show had been disrupted. The host was supposed to dominate. The guest was supposed to fumble. But this time, the script had flipped. A panelist, a younger commentator known for parroting network-approved lines, cleared his throat, desperate to break the tension. "Well, that was a lot," he said, forcing an awkward chuckle. "But let's be real here, Karoline. The media isn't perfect, sure, but you're acting like one side is completely innocent. Right-wing outlets push misinformation all the time. You expect us to believe they're any better. A lifeline. A distraction. An attempt to drag Karoline back into a debate she had already won. She could have taken the easy route, thrown out a standard both sides have their flaws response and moved on. But she wasn't about to let them shift the focus. "That's not the argument," she said, turning her attention to the panelist. "I'm not here to defend anyone. I'm here to hold you accountable. Your network. Your leadership. Your narratives. Every time you're caught misleading the public, you pivot. You blame others. You change the subject." The young panelist faltered. This wasn't what he signed up for. Graham, still recovering, finally leaned forward, desperate to regain control. "Okay, Karoline," he said, his voice a little sharper now. "You've made your point. But let's not pretend this is some kind of conspiracy. We make mistakes, sure, but so does every media outlet. That doesn't mean there's an agenda. A weak defense. A last-ditch attempt to frame everything as simple human error. Karoline exhaled softly, shaking her head. Graham, mistakes happen. But these aren't mistakes. They're patterns. And patterns tell a story. She gestured toward the papers she had set on the desk earlier. This isn't just one bad headline, one off-base report. It's years of deception. Repeated narratives designed to control public perception. And when the truth finally comes out, your network acts like it never happened. No retractions. No apologies. Just silence. Graham shifted again, but the fight was leaving him. He knew she was right. But admitting it, that was something he simply couldn't do. Behind the cameras, the producers were frantic, throwing signals. The interview had veered into dangerous territory. The control they once had over the conversation was gone. Graham glanced toward the teleprompter. A new message had appeared. Cut to break. But he knew it was too late. The damage had already been done. The screen abruptly cut to commercial. The audience barely had time to register the sudden shift before an upbeat jingle for a pharmaceutical ad filled the air. But it didn't matter. The moment had already burned itself into their minds. Back in the studio, the tension was thick. Graham ripped off his earpiece, his face tight with frustration as he turned toward his producers. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath. Karoline didn't move. She sat calmly in her chair, watching the scramble around her. The panelists murmured amongst themselves, some shaking their heads, others stealing nervous glances at the host. A makeup assistant rushed onto the set, dabbing at Graham's forehead as he exhaled sharply, trying to regain composure. But there was no recovering from this. The damage had already spread beyond the studio. The show was being live-streamed on social media, and within seconds, the clips started making their rounds. First, short snippets, Karoline holding up the headlines, Graham sitting in stunned silence. Then, full-length breakdowns. Captions called it the most embarrassing moment of his career. Twitter was on fire. Breaking. Karoline Leavitt destroys mainstream media hypocrisy live on air. Graham Walters left speechless. I never thought I'd see the day someone made Graham Walters shut up. Iconic. This is what happens when corporate media finally gets called out in real time. They have no defense. No way they let her back on this network again. She just burned their entire narrative to the ground. Within minutes, conservative outlets picked up the story. Karoline Leavitt obliterates liberal media's lies in explosive showdown. Network host left stammering as guest exposes years of deception. But it wasn't just right-wing media taking notice. Even independent journalists, usually wary of taking sides, were sharing the clip, calling it the moment corporate news finally got caught. The network's PR team scrambled, desperately trying to control the narrative. But the Internet had already made up its mind. As the commercial break neared its end, Graham inhaled deeply, forcing a composed expression back onto his face. The makeup artist retreated. The producers signaled 30 seconds. He turned to Karoline, his voice lower now, laced with irritation. "We're coming back from break. I suggest you reel it in." Karoline simply smiled. "I don't take suggestions from people who lost the argument." Graham clenched his jaw. But he had no time to respond. The screen flashed back. The intro music played. The camera zoomed in. He plastered on his usual media-friendly grin. But the energy had shifted. The audience wasn't looking at him the same way. They had seen something they weren't supposed to see. and no amount of damage control could change that. The broadcast continued, but it didn't matter anymore. The moment had already escaped their control. The audience wasn't focused on what Graham was saying. They were replaying the silence, the hesitation, the way Karoline had turned his own tactics against him. He tried to regain the rhythm, to steer the conversation back into safe territory. All right, let's shift gears. But it was too late. People weren't buying it. In the control room, the producers scrambled. The network's executives were already on the phone, discussing how to spin the damage, how to handle the inevitable fallout. Some were calling for a media blackout. Don't acknowledge it. Don't amplify it. Let it die out. Others were drafting statements, preparing their damage control strategy. But none of it would work, because something had changed. Viewers had seen, in real time, what it looked like when power was challenged, when narratives crumbled under the weight of truth, when someone refused to be silenced. And that was something they wouldn't forget. Karoline knew it, too. As soon as the segment wrapped, she walked off the set with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout. No gloating, no celebration, just certainty. One of the younger staffers, probably an intern, caught up with her near the exit. "Miss Leavitt, that was... wow," he said, shaking his head. "They're definitely not inviting you back after this." She smirked. "They were never planning to invite me back." And that was the truth. This had never been about fair debate. The network had booked her expecting an easy win, a punching bag to reinforce their narrative. Instead, they had handed her a platform, and she had used it to tear their credibility apart, piece by piece.